I'm Arthur Brandwood. Welcome to Medical Devices in Taiwan, Leveraging CE and FDA, our May 2018 webinar. I have with me my colleague, Jenny Lin, consultant in our Sydney office here. Jenny's actually from Taipei, and she's one of our Taiwan specialists here in Brandwood Biomedical, and she'll be joining in with the questions and answer session at the end. Just a bit of background about Taiwan. Its population about 24 million now. Market size a couple of years ago of getting up towards $5 billion and growing quite strongly. It's something like 7 or 8% a year. It's one of Asia's most advanced markets. About 70% of high-end devices are imported. About 30% of those come from the United States. And for those of you who've been to Taiwan will know it's an advanced country, a high level of tertiary education, and a sophisticated health system with a very large amount of public health delivery. There is a demand for the latest technology. The demographics, about 13% of the population are over 65. Like all others, it's aging. And most of the care is delivered to public patients in Taiwan. That translates into opportunity for people who want to export medical devices to Taiwan. Let's begin with the Taiwan FDA and the legislation. The Taiwan Food and Drug Administration regulates food, drugs, medical devices, and cosmetics, very similar to the US FDA. A little bit of history at the bottom there. The regulation dates back to 1993 when the Pharmaceutical Affairs Act was enacted. The management systems were reformed in 2000. Medical devices registration really began in serious way in 2005. And in 2010, the Taiwan FDA was established under the Department of Health. And in 2013, it was elevated to the Ministry of Health and Welfare. We've seen this across many Asian jurisdictions over the last few years where regulatory agencies have been effectively promoted in terms of their importance and taken on a higher status. And that's certainly happened in Taiwan. Taiwan takes medical device and pharmaceutical regulations very seriously. There is a typical act and regulations and regulatory instrument structure. So the act is the Pharmaceutical Affairs Act of 2017, the latest version. The regulations are the regulations for registration and management of medical devices, and the Taiwan FDA then publishes a range of guidances such as the guidance for medical device labeling, for post-market activities, and product-specific preclinical guidances. There's a range of different documents there, and the link on the screen works. You will get a copy of the slides at the end, and you can look at that. And you can go to the guidance on the Taiwan FDA website and to the legislation. Let's just look at some key points of how regulation works in Taiwan. Firstly, there are a number of things you have to gain a Taiwan FDA regulatory approval. Of course, the whole process is focused on safety and efficacy of the device, but you must have, firstly, a country of origin approval. If the device is not approved in the country in which it is manufactured, or the country of the legal manufacturer, then you cannot proceed with a regulatory approval in Taiwan. Similar to the arrangements in other parts of Asia, including in mainland China, you must have a country of origin approval. The predicate device in Taiwan is strongly preferred. You can go forward without a Taiwan predicate, but it makes things so much easier if there is a device already approved in Taiwan, which is effectively the same or similar to your device, and you can refer to it in your submission. You need to have a valid manufacturing quality system certification, and that's called a QSD certificate, and we'll come to the detail of that later. But you need to have valid quality system controls, either as ISO 13485 or a US FDA registration and audit. And we will talk about that in some detail. And then you need a local market agency, market agent in Taiwan, a sponsor. The Taiwan FDA deals with a legal entity in Taiwan. You can't make an application from offshore, so everything must be done through a local Taiwan sponsor. That can be your distributor, or you can use an independent regulatory agency, a regulatory consultancy or service agent to do that. And that's one of the services Brandwood Biomedical offers to be able to support registration in Taiwan. There are some common documents to all regulatory submissions. Firstly, the labeling materials must be in Chinese and in English, and the Chinese is traditional Mandarin script. That differs from the rest of China, which uses the simplified Mandarin script. In Taiwan, labeling has to be in traditional Mandarin script as well as in English. You need a QSD certificate for quality systems. That's a certificate issued by the Taiwan FDA. You need to have your preclinical testing and quality testing reports. You need product information, instructions for use and product information. You need, for high-risk devices, to submit a clinical evidence report. And you need, on top of all of this technical documentation, there needs to be a formal authorization letter from the legal manufacturer appointing the local agent, and that authorization letter forms part of the submission package. And finally, the sponsor must have an appropriate business license to operate in Taiwan to act as a sponsor. For Class 3 medical devices, the technical documentation that's submitted must be in the standard technical dossier format that's used in other Global Harmonization Task Force jurisdictions. So the STED format is mandatory for the technical dossiers for Class 3 devices. So let's begin with looking at the quality systems documentation. QSD, the QSD certificate. This is a certificate that's actually issued by Taiwan FDA, and you have to obtain it before you can proceed to the next step of product registration. The product registration requires the existence of a prior QSD with the product within the scope, and the two will be linked in the registration databases. So once you get your QSD, it's valid for 3 years. It takes a while to renew the QSD, so effectively after 2.5 years, you have to begin the renewal process again. One little nuance of the system here is that the QSD validity cycle is a different length to the device regulatory approval cycle, and so the two can get out of step. The QSD certificate is issued and has to be renewed every 3 years, and you have to start the filing of the renewal 6 months before the expiry. It takes 120 calendar days for the Taiwan FDA to review the application for QSD, and Class 1 non-sterile and non-measuring devices do not require a QSD certificate, similar to other self-declared devices in Europe and other jurisdictions where there is no formal requirement for quality system certification. There are 3 ways of getting a QSD. The first is an abridged pathway for US manufacturers. And the way that works is that you submit to the Taiwan FDA the US FDA's most recent establishment inspection report, a certificate to foreign government issued by the FDA verifying that the device is able to be legally supplied in the United States, and if you have it, an ISO 13485 certificate. The second abridged pathway for European manufacturers, including Switzerland and Liechtenstein in the European Economic Area. In those cases, you do a similar thing. You submit your most recent inspection report from the European notified body. You supply a free sales certificate validating that the device is legally able to be sold in Europe, and you supply your ISO 13485 certificate. In each of these cases, you submit this information to the Taiwan FDA, where it's then reviewed, and the QSD certificate is issued based on this information. If you do not hold a European or a US regulatory approval and quality certification, then there is a third pathway, which is called as the standard pathway, where you submit an ISO 13485 certificate if you have it, plus your full quality manual, quality procedure and manufacturing flowchart, and that will be reviewed by the Taiwan FDA. If all else fails, you can, of course, submit to a direct Taiwan quality systems audit, but that almost never happens. Taiwan FDA doesn't usually audit outside of the country for medical devices. So these are the three ways forward. The reviewing process works a bit like this. Firstly, you file your submission for QSD with Taiwan FDA. And the Taiwan FDA then, once they've administratively accepted that, will pass it to an external third-party reviewer for a technical review. That takes about 30 days, and the reviewer then raises any questions and passes those back to the agency, where they are passed on to the applicant. The applicant is allowed 60 days to review and respond to those questions. And then it goes back to the third-party reviewer, who gets another 30 days to look at your review responses and then pass the submission back to the agency for decision, and the agency issues its own final decision. The review questions will typically include matters such as wanting more detail on the nature of the process, or the layout of the factory, sometimes floor plans, that sort of thing. So there is a substantive look at how the quality system operates and the facilities to which it controls. This whole process, therefore, takes about 120 days to get your QSD certificate in place. But it can be more complicated than that. What happens in most medical device operations, certainly in all but the smallest of manufacturers, is that there may be more than one manufacturing plant. Here's a theoretical schema for a manufacturer that's got 4 different manufacturing plants and a sterilization vendor. And products may move from plant to plant. They may be made in one plant, as product A is here, or product B and here may be made possibly in 2 separate plants, then brought together and then sent off to a sterilization vendor externally, and then brought back again and then released. The question is, who gets the QSD certificate? Because the issue is a QSD certificate is issued to a specific plant at a specific address. The answer is typically it's the site which does the final product release, the final quality release. There's a kind of a pharmaceutical mindset to how this works. There's a very great deal of interest in the final QC release of product, and that's the site that gets issued the QSD. It can be, of course, even more complex than that, where you may have a large number of sites and a flexible manufacturing arrangement to move things around. And we have in the past had to negotiate directly with the Taiwan FDA on behalf of a manufacturer which had just such an arrangement and had for many years held a QSD certificate in the name of their corporate headquarters, which in fact was an office block. The Taiwan FDA raised a query on one particular round of renewal simply because the US FDA had changed the format of the establishment inspection report and listed all of the manufacturing facilities directly on the report for the first time, which then raised awareness amongst the agency that there were more than one plant covered under the QSD. And eventually, it was possible to negotiate with the agency to demonstrate control of the quality system from the corporate headquarters and effectively control of all the product release. And therefore, the agency was then prepared to issue a single QSD certificate for the whole organization. But you can get complicated diversions such as that. But the simple principle is one QSD certificate for one set of product release, and then those products which are released at that facility are associated with that QSD certificate in the subsequent approval step. So let's look at that product approval process, the product registration process. Firstly, Taiwan operates a risk-based classification with 3 classes, class 1, 2, and 3, from low risk through to high risk. For class 1 devices, they still have to be registered, but it's a declaration statement only. For class 2 devices of moderate risk, there is a need to submit technical data. And for class 3 devices, which are higher risk, the technical data have to be in a STED format, and you submit a larger quantity of data, essentially. So let's look at the reviewing timelines. For class 2 devices, applications are submitted to TFDA. The agency takes about 2 weeks to administratively accept and allocate the submission to a reviewer. And then at that point, the clock starts, and TFDA has 75 calendar days to conduct its first round of review. The TFDA will then issue formal review questions to the applicant, and the applicant has 60 days approximately to respond to the TFDA. There's a tight timeline on preparing your response, just 60 days. You submit your response, and the TFDA is then allowed another 65 days to finalize the application and come to a decision. So it's a single round of review with a relatively short time to provide your review responses. That's for class 2 devices. For class 3, same process, only the timelines are slightly different. So the application is submitted to TFDA, again, a 2-week review and acceptance process. And then this time, TFDA is allowed 105 calendar days to conduct their review. You get your questions, and again, you get 60 days only to respond. And then it goes back to TFDA, and this time they have 95 calendar days to finalize the application. Now, one thing about Taiwan FDA is it is pretty good with deadlines. They measure themselves closely against their deadlines, and they do, by and large, meet these deadlines or come in under them. And certainly in the review process, if you're slow with your responses, you're going to get reminders, and things will move along according to the clock. The pre-market submission documents are like this. This is set out for class 1, class 2, class 3, and devices which are completely new in design, structure, or material, or a combination. So for class 1 devices, it's a self-declaration. You must hold the preclinical and quality control testing on file, and your labeling must comply with requirements. For class 2 devices and class 3, you need the common document set that we referred to earlier in the presentation, plus the QSD certificate. For class 2 devices, you will need to have a technical file, and the clinical evaluation may be required to be submitted. Sometimes the agency will specifically request that. For US and CE approved devices, if the device has both a US and a CE approval, then you're exempted from requirement to submit preclinical and QC testing reports. So this speeds things up quite a bit. The review goes much more quickly, and there's much less technical data. Essentially, the agency relies upon the existence of prior US and CE approved devices for approvals for class 2 devices, and will waive the review of much of the technical content of the submission. So that can give you a fast track approval for class 2 devices. For class 3 devices, though, there is always a full review based on submission of a summary technical file in the STED format, including a clinical evaluation report, and the submission of an essential principles checklist. And Taiwan uses the essential principles of the Global Harmonization Task Force as their essential principles checklist. For devices which may be completely new to Taiwan, with a completely new design or structure or material, then there may be a need to a more detailed review with a full technical file, including clinical evaluation report, to be reviewed. that doesn't happen very often, but it's completely new technology. The agency will take a deeper look. So just looking at how these US and EU approvals allow exemption from preclinical and QC testing reports. If you have either an FDA registration, and you can show evidence of that, or you have an EC certificate, then, as I said just now, the agency then allows you to file an application without the preclinical testing and the clinical report, and they will simply go forward on the basis of an administrative review of the existing overseas approvals. And for Class 3, the GHTF STED format is mandatory. And just for those of you who might need a reminder, this is what it looks like. There's the contents list from the GHTF. So you want to see the overall descriptions, the essential principle checklist, a risk analysis summary, an overview of design and manufacturing information, the preclinical product verification testing, and the clinical evaluation report for validation, plus the labeling in both English and traditional Mandarin, and the clinical evidence. Let's just take a look at acceptance of clinical data in Taiwan, and the use of international data. It's a question that often comes up. Does Taiwan require trials to be done in Taiwan? Will they accept international data? And the simple answer is that Taiwan generally accepts international data. The regulations say, like it does in the rest of China and in other parts of the world, that the clinical data are acceptable from anywhere, subject that they are compliant with GCP, equivalent to the local Taiwan GCP. And since Taiwan effectively uses GCP based around ISO 14155, then all advanced jurisdictions are going to have acceptable GCP. And secondly, applicability of the data to Taiwan usage in terms of the population, ethnicity, genetics, as well as clinical practices and other cultural factors. All of that is in the regulation, and that can be problematic in some other jurisdictions with acceptance of international data, but in practice, it is very rare for Taiwan to require local clinical data. If there is international data, they will accept it. In theory, if there are local or regional differences in the indication or in the population or in the clinical practices, you will need to do local trials, but in practice this almost never happens. There are guidances on clinical data. There's a Q&A on handling of clinical data from overseas countries, and a couple of other guidances. They're listed on the webpage, and they're easily found on the Taiwan FDA website. Let's move to labeling. Product labeling, yes, it must be in traditional Mandarin. There is a specific requirement that warnings, contraindications, precautions, and other side effects are identified on the labeling, either in bold black or in a red box, as shown here on the screen. The labeling must identify both the manufacturer and the sponsor. The Chinese product name must not include any Western letter or number or other symbol. It has to be only traditional Mandarin characters. And the model number and overall specifications must also be identified on the label. So here's the whole process in summary. For device registration in Taiwan. For Class 1 devices, there is no requirement for a QSD certificate. There is no requirement for a country of origin approval. There is no requirement to submit technical or clinical data or a technical file. You do need to hold a certain number of administrative documents, and products provided sterile and some other Class 1 devices also require a QSD, but they are the exceptions to the rule. But generally, Class 1 devices are simply self-declared, and the manufacturer must hold the evidence that they comply with regulations. Very similar to what goes on in Europe, in Australia, and in other jurisdictions that use a GHGF regulatory model. For Class 2 devices, you must have a QSD, you must have a country of origin approval, and generally you need to submit preclinical testing and QC testing reports and clinical evaluation reports, although if you have both European and FDA approval, you can skip that part. The technical file does not have to be in a STED format, and again, the administrative documents have to be held. And then for Class 3, you need the whole set. QSD, country of origin approval, full preclinical and data and a clinical evaluation report, a technical file in the STED format, and again, the administrative documents. Registrations have to be renewed, and as I said before, the QSD is on a 3-year renewal cycle. The product registration is on a 5-year renewal cycle, so they do get out of step. A product registration is granted for 5 years, and again, the re-registration needs to be submitted within 6 months prior to the registration certificate expiration date. Not more than 6 months, but within that 6-month period, you need to file the registration certificate renewal. The QSD, 3 years of validity, and the re-registration must be submitted at least 6 months prior to the registration certificate expiration date. So you need to manage your calendars and not forget to get back to the agency with appropriate renewals at the right times. Otherwise, you'll find that you've got lapses in registrations or QSD certificates, and you have to start all over again. Now, what happens if you get a product variation? Firstly, technical variations and administrative variations, 2 different types. A technical variation is where there is a change of an intended purpose or an indication for use in the device. An administrative variation is when you've got a change of a product name, a change of manufacturer or sponsor information, a change of the instructions for use, or an additional removal of a model number and specification. 2 types. Those variations, you need to file a submission back to the agency for review of the variation. And the technical variation, of course, involves a review of some technical information, administrative information not. And maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion of that in the question and answer session in a moment as to how this process works. There are some changes coming along in Taiwan, and we'd just like to review those briefly. There is a new Medical Device Management Act, which has been put through, and there are some changes to be implemented under that new act. Firstly, the definition of manufacturer has been expanded and now includes legal entities that design and place devices on the market under their own name. So in other words, the Act now explicitly uses the concept of a legal manufacturer as used in other jurisdictions. So that's really a clarification. It's always been interpreted that way, but it's now quite explicit in the Act. There is a new category of medical, an expansion of the definition of medical device dealers, and that's now expanded to legal entities that lease, service, or repair medical devices. So organizations that do that in Taiwan are now explicitly included within the scope of the operations of the Act. There is, as we are seeing across most of the East Asian and Southeast Asian jurisdictions, an implementation of good distribution practice. Most of these economies rely on a substantial proportion of imported medical devices, and manufacturers are expected to establish good distribution practice, in particular tracking systems for supplying, sourcing, and the records of the distribution of the devices so they can be tracked through the supply chain. For the purposes of things like recalls, for example. There is a new online registration process for Class 1 devices being implemented, which will mean that some Class 1 devices in the beginning, not all, will be changed over to an electronic listing with a simplified application, and you will be required to update that annually to maintain your registration validity. So moving over to online submissions for Class 1 devices. There are some cases where you don't require a license. That's been expanded in the new Act to include, to be explicit about licenses not being required for clinical trials, samples and gifts for purpose of self-use, devices shown at trade exhibitions, devices used in research or by charities, and medical devices supplied for maintenance and repair purposes only, in other words, spare parts. All of these activities do not require a TFDA license. And finally, post-market surveillance has been stepped up in the new Act, where there is now a requirement for medical device dealers to provide safety monitoring reports periodically and to notify adverse events where a device has got a potential to compromise safety of the human body and take corrective preventive action. So if you've got a safety issue that arises, that's something that's notified with the agency and corrective actions required. So I think we'll stop at that point. Thank you for your attention, and we'll now move to questions. And maybe I can start with the first question, Jenny, and just ask a little bit about variation submissions and how they work compared to primary submissions.
Yeah. So as Arthur mentioned earlier, there are two types of variation submissions. One is administrative and the other one is technical. Generally speaking, if you make changes to IFU, it really depends on what sort of changes that has been made. If it's just font size, font type, or it's just a general format changes, normally it will be considered as administrative changes. But we've seen that if manufacturers wanted to add model numbers, it depends on whether there is any changes to your technical contents. If there is, normally TFDA would require preclinical testing and QC reports. So what level of documents that is required actually depends on whether you have technical changes to your product or product specifications. Yes.
Okay, and what sort of timeline does it take to do an administrative compared to a technical review?
So typically for administrative variation is shorter than reviewing of the technical variations, but TFDA does not have like a strict timeline for the differences, but from our experiences, administrative is always faster.
Roughly how much?
It's about 2 months for administrative, and for the technical review, it will be, well, it depends on what sort of changes are made.
Yeah. So it could be shorter or longer, but essentially administrative reviews go through in a couple of months, technical reviews a bit longer, but there are no formal timelines for these changes, these variation reviews. Thank you. Okay, we have a bunch of other questions here. Let me just see. We've got a question here from Danica, who just wants some clarification around the timing of renewal of QSD and product license submissions, the difference between prior to and within the 6-month time frame. Can we just clarify that? So QSD submissions, you need to submit at least 6 months out?
Yes, so that means that you can actually submit 8 months beforehand, before the expiry date.
But what about product renewals? Will they only accepted within the 6-month window? Is that what happens?
Yes.
So you can't submit any earlier than 6 months?
Yes.
So I hope that's clear. So QSD, submit as early as you like. Product renewals will only be accepted within the window of time 6 months before the renewal. Thank you. So I hope that's clear, Danica. So we have a question from Devon. When do the new medical regulation changes, which we just mentioned, the new act, when does it all go into effect?
Yeah. So actually, TFDA hasn't announced the implementation date. So at the moment, we still don't know when it will be implemented. Yeah.
Okay. What in your experience is the practice? I know that they'll change things very often, but how long does it typically take them to announce and implement a regulatory change in Taiwan?
Well, it takes a while because they have to go through all the legislative yuan and, they have to approve and then executive yuan. So it's a long process.
It's a long process, so it might take a little while yet. Yeah. So it's been the act has been announced, but it's going to take a while to implement yet. So I would imagine that's going to be some months away at least. Yeah. Okay. Do you know if Taiwan's considering accepting MDSAP in the future? Asked Pete. Would an MDSAP audit certificate be something that would be useful for Taiwan regulatory purposes? I don't know if the agencies mention that.
No, there is no relevant information about MDSAP to be used by TFDA. But this is something that maybe we're not sure whether they would accept in the future. Yeah.
I know that the Asian Harmonization Working Party is having a look at MDSAP, and I think there's a certain amount of disquiet about the value of MDSAP for jurisdictions in this region. So I think the answer, Pete, is that not anytime soon. I would be surprised to see MDSAP entering into the formal regulatory framework in Taiwan in the near future. Shoshi asks, while submitting audit reports from the notified body in Europe, is it necessary to submit CAPA plans for the mitigation of nonconformities identified in the report?
Yes. Normally, the third-party reviewer will request that if there's any nonconformity items on the report. Yeah, we've actually been requested by TFDA about this before. So normally, this is typically would be requested. Yeah.
Okay. So you'll need to provide your audit report and expect to get questions about any non-conformances. Would it be sensible to simply submit the CAPA plan at the beginning with your so be preemptive?
Yes, that would be our recommendation.
So the best thing to do is actually supply both at the beginning. So be preemptive. You provide your inspection report plus any closeouts of non-conformances. Aparna asks, are IVDs considered as medical devices in Taiwan?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Regulated under the same process?
Yes.
So essentially just another type of medical device?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And how are they classified?
It is essentially classified as in the classification catalog. It is similar to what is how medical devices is classified. Similar to the USA.
The Taiwan classification system has essentially been developed based on the US FDA's approach to classification, correct? Yes. So there is a classification catalog, and IVD classifications in Taiwan are going to be pretty much the same as they are in the United States. What about combination products? Kai Cheng asks, are there any regulations specific to combination products in Taiwan?
Normally, it depends on the intended purpose and the function of the combination product. It can be considered as medical device in Taiwan, but there's a separate review from the pharmaceutical department to review your drug component. So normally it will take a longer time to review your product registration if you do have a drug component.
So it would be the same sort of principle that's in most jurisdictions, that they look at the primary mode of action.
Yes.
And so if it's primary mode like a A drug-eluting stent is still a stent, so it's a medical device, whereas some other things which may be primarily something with a drug delivery device, where the primary means is actually getting the drug in there, is going to be regulated as a drug.
Yeah.
Okay, so the primary mode of action determines which path it goes through, but the medicines are subject to review as well if you've got a drug medicine combination, a device medicine combination. Okay, thank you. So we have, let me just see, other questions here. Another question here from Danica. Do spare parts require traditional Chinese labels? So if you're supplying spare parts, how do they have to be labeled? Do you know that?
The spare parts, well, it depends on whether the spare part is included in the registration certificate. Normally you will have, well, it also depends on the size of the spare parts. Obviously, you can't have the label on really small parts. But if your device includes the spare parts and the main device, you'll require the labelings for all parts. Yeah.
So parts that are typically supplied as accessories or as service parts would normally be shipped with local labeling.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the answer is essentially yes, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just see what other questions we've got here. Missed any?
There's a question about new medical device from Danica.
Yes, again, Danica, thank you. You have plenty of questions for us. Class 1 device registrations. If a Class 1 certificate is already available and we have a new Class 1 device that can use the license, are there any registration activities required? I'm interpreting that as, can we group registrations, particularly for Class 1 devices?
So again, we have to look at the classification catalog. If they belong to the same group in that catalog, then yes, it can be listed on the same certificate.
Okay, so that's for Class 1 devices. Does that apply for all classes or just Class 1?
All classes.
So you can group, if the devices fit the description of the catalog, then you can put them all on one registration statement.
Yes.
Okay, so they can be grouped. Now, Diane has just come up with a question saying, can we explain a bit more about classification? Is it closer to US FDA or Europe? I think we've just talked about that. It's a catalog-based system.
Yes.
So it's not like the European system which uses risk rules. It's a catalog-based system, which essentially is almost a copy of the US FDA's 21 CFR classification regulations. In other words, you'll see the same devices and the same sort of descriptions and with a Taiwan classification number.
Yes.
So that's how it works. So I hope that explains it to you, Diane. Essentially, it's a close copy of what's done in the United States. And I think that's probably all of the questions. I don't think we've missed any. Oh, one final one. Thank you, Danica. A third question from you. In variation submissions, do all changes to instructions for use need to be submitted for review?
Yeah. So I just mentioned earlier, typically if you normally changes to IFU will require notification to TFDA. However, if it's just the format change, like font size, then it doesn't require notification to TFDA. Actually, TFDA has a notice of changes that is not, so the notice of changes which are not required notification, but essentially this is only for the format of IFU. Not really, like if you have the technical changes like indication or any the actions of the medical device or any addition of addition of product specifications, then this is typically required.
Technical content of the IFU requires a variation submission.
Yes.
Tidying up the format, changing the format, etc., does not.
Yep.
Okay, that's clear. Thank you. Okay, well, I think at that point we'll draw to a close. Thank you all for your attention and for being our audience today. We do these webinars approximately monthly, usually around the third Wednesday of the month, depending on where you are and which time zone you're in, of course. Look out for what's coming up. We have webinars coming up over the next couple of months on global clinical evidence requirements, on what's going on here in Australia with regulatory reforms and acceptance of things other than CE, where the TGA is now actively looking at accepting US FDA approvals as the basis for an Australian registration. And we'll also be looking at implementation of MDSAP and how that is used around the world, and particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. So thank you again for your attention. Thank you, Jenny, for your expertise.
Thank you.
It's a fascinating regulatory system. The Taiwan FDA is quite sophisticated. I love going to Taipei and seeing what goes on. It really is a technologically advanced country in Taiwan. It's a fascinating place. And thank you all, and we'll see you next week. We'll see you next month. Thank you. So back again on the third Wednesday of June.